Hello and welcome to India Speak, a podcast by the Center for Policy Research. This is the third episode in a series of podcasts called The Road to COP27. The first podcast featured Harold Winkler from South Africa, the second Salimul Haq from Bangladesh, and today we have with us Professor Rachel Kyte from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today, Rachel, in this conversation in the build-up to COP27.
No, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Let me introduce listeners to Rachel, who is really somebody with a deep history of engagement in the climate debate, as well as with a very distinguished track record. So as I said, Rachel is currently the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And in the past, she served as Special Representative of the UN Secretary General, as well as Chief Executive Officer of something called Sustainable Energy for All, a very important body that is really focused on trying to get energy access for all peoples around the world. She also has a background at the World Bank, where she was Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, and also played an important role at the International Finance Corporation, responsible for ESG risk and business advisory services. So Rachel, like a couple of the other speakers we've had on this series, combines an academic background with deep policy engagement and has been a long and distinguished voice on a lot of climate issues. So is a wonderful person to have as part of the series leading up to COP27. So thank you again, Rachel, for joining us. I thought we might kick off actually by asking you to take us through the political context for COP27. This is an interesting COP to be held in Egypt. It comes against the backdrop of a lot of high-profile climate impacts this year. It also comes at a time when developing countries, particularly African nations, are making a strong case that their ability to access fossil fuels shouldn't be restricted, that if there are scarce fossil fuels to be used because of climate change, maybe poorer countries should have first dibs at them in a sense. We see Europe roiled by energy security issues in the wake of this Russia-Ukraine war that's going on. So there's a lot of ferment, and in a sense, it's perhaps sets a different sort of stage for this COP as compared to past COPs. Would you agree with that? And how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I think that's a very apt question. I think that the science only gets more, alarming every year, and this year's no different. This year, I think everybody everywhere is feeling the impacts of climate change. So that starts to I think change the political calculus. It changes the psyche, the sort of the general public's view of climate change globally as well. And then we're coming off the back of, a number of very difficult years economically. So we were already seeing the beginning of inflationary pressure. We were seeing a deeply divided world, with the IMF talking about the corrosive effect of inequality and before the pandemic. Then we had the pandemic, which obviously brought huge public health challenges around the world, but brought with it enormous economic dislocation, commodity price rises, etc. And then we've had on the back of that, which most countries in the global south have not got through, right? They're still enmeshed in that. And then we now have a war on European soil. We have this great power rivalry, which is really testing the limits of the multilateralism that we have been used to for the last 70 odd years. And so if we have a crisis of the likes of climate, a sort of big market failure, global public goods crisis, existential threat, whatever you want to think of it or frame it as, then we need more cooperation. We need the harnessing of the way in which we manage our economies behind the science. All of that is difficult to do, both domestically and in terms of cooperation at this particular point in time. And then we're having it in Egypt. So it's an Africa COP. So the African unanswered questions on loss and damage, the unanswered questions on climate finance, the unanswered questions on availability of the right priced capital or access to trading systems, their fears about being excluded, all come to the fore. And it's in Egypt. And Egypt's got some complicated neighborhood relationships. Its relationship with Ethiopia, its relationship with the rest of Africa, its relationship with the UAE, the next hosts, with Turkey, etc. There's a complicated place in a complicated agenda at a complicated time.
Well, I think, I thought I'd try to paint a picture of complexity, and you took it sort of several levels beyond that, but I think quite appropriately so. And importantly brought in the role of China and whether the sort of the world order that we become used to is poised on the brink of change. You, I think, quite appropriately said it raises a lot of unanswered questions. So let me ask this: to what extent is this mechanism of COPs, these annual meetings at the Conference of Parties, really the place increasingly to address these questions? Or do these questions need to be addressed somewhere else with the details kind of ironed out at COPs? And what are those other fora? Is the G20, and of course in India, the G20 is being watched very closely because we are the next chair. Where is the place to have these conversations?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think it's a both and answer, right? So we need a place where we manage the mechanics of working together on climate change, and that's the COP. And it's interesting that however much we decry it, because we've got climate negotiations who don't understand how private finance works or whatever, every other issue is like, oh, I wish we had a COP that works like the climate COP, so the biodiversity or other global public goods issues, because it's a thermostat, and it's an annual health check. It is the spring cleaning that you need to do every year to make sure that you've got everything and you're in track and everybody knows what they're supposed to do. So I think it's a very important yearly pulse with a lot of other intersessional meetings and stuff going on. I would like it to go a bit faster, and I think Simon Steele, the new executive secretary, is sort of really looking at what are the most important things and how does he move forward. And I think it has a fundamental challenge, which is how do you work with non-state actors? This is going to be a big issue at this COP, and it's going to be a recurring issue and something for a longer discussion, I think, Navroz. But then climate is everything, and everything is climate. And so now you see an extraordinary amount of attention really being paid to climate finally at the recent annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. I've just been listening to the governors of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. The two big topics are how to be counter-cyclical and how to be counter-cyclical in a climate crisis. So all of the multilateral financial system is now focused on this because of the macroprudential risk issues. We now see it coming up in the trade discussions. I think Ngozi Iweala, the Director General of the WTO, is looking very hard at how to bridge the sustainability and trade discussions. It's something that the world has punted on a regular basis for the last 30 years. And we see it creeping into, obviously, the whole phalanx of issues that the UN deals with in terms of peace and security, as well as development, as well as humanitarian affairs. And then, of course, we don't have a functioning Security Council, but if we did, this would be a much more recurring theme there as well. So, yes, climate is now discussed in all of those places. And then we come together once a year in terms of COP, in a little bit of a jamboree, but also a very serious diplomatic meeting. And we need that because that is our pacemaker, it is our thermostat, it is what keeps us working together so that we understand where we are. Of course, next year, we will have a formal stock taking to see where we are. But we do need to marry the excitement of what's going on in some of the private markets, the dismay about what's going on in some of the public finances in many countries, with the possibility of what's happening technologically, with also then the politics of how difficult some of this is.
Yeah, I think that's really, the linkages, as you say, are really far flung, and I really like the idea of the COPs as an annual health check, and I have to say I sort of feel as exhausted after coming out of one of these COPs. It's actually personally not a bad metaphor for how one feels coming out of these things. wrung dry. You said climate is everything and everything is climate, and I think that's absolutely right. And obviously, there's a set of things to unpack from that. The sort of agenda items of the COP, and we'll maybe go through some of those: finance and loss and damage and so on. But before I do that, given your vantage point in the US, the climate is everything phrase also made me think of recent political developments in the US. In other words, the somewhat surprise, in a good way, surprise passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think it's the fact that the most progressive climate legislation in history in the US is called the Inflation Reduction Act should teach us all something. And it speaks to this theme of sort of the expansiveness of how we talk about climate, the climate is everything theme. So just a couple of minutes on what your take is on that, and what you think that means for how the US will approach this COP. So maybe a couple of the significant actors, the US, and then also maybe touching on the Europeans, as whether they will continue their active role or will they be somewhat on the back foot, given the recent energy security crisis, the fact that they've had to actually double down on fossil fuel subsidies to get their consumers through the winter, and so on. So maybe into a couple of these blocks before we get into some of these issues.
Well, so the climate is everything. Everything is climate. I borrowed from one of the brightest and best climate journalists in the US at the moment, Justin Warland, in a long piece that he wrote for Time magazine earlier this year. And so, yes, in US politics, climate is everything, as long as it's not called climate. The Inflation Reduction Act is important not only in the letter of the law, but in what it will inspire within the private sector and within private financial markets, I think. So, in fact, I was joking with a friend of mine in the run-up to COP27 that every meeting I go to, the number that is given to the amount of investment that the IRA will inspire, if not legislate, just keeps going up. And by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, we'll be in some extraordinary stratospheric number. But I think that the rudiment is true. So this is the bridge that the Biden administration, I think, hopes that they've achieved, which is that if you walk around and you talk to my neighbors, or you go to any community, people want reasonable energy bills, which come from making their houses more energy efficient. It comes from doubling down on renewable energy. People are frustrated with the quality of infrastructure in this country. It's decaying. Well, the new infrastructure, the new grids, the new smart grids, all of that, leans into a renewable energy future. And people want a car that they can afford to run, and increasingly that's an electric vehicle, and they like the ideas of electric vehicles, and they like traveling in electric vehicles, and they'd like to use public transport, but it would have to be available and clean, and the air quality would have to be good, and all that. So people want all of this, right? And depending on how old they are, then they're prepared to engage about climate change as a topic as well. But that's what people want. And I think that that's what the Biden administration has done with the IRA and also with the CHIPS Act. Now, embedded in that is also something which is going to be very interesting for the next period, which is the degree of local content that is expected in this push to green. And also the amount of sort of onshoring or friendshoring. And there are going to be some awkward and difficult conversations amongst allies and trading partners as we try to take away the concentration of global supply chains from one point of origin, in particular in solar in the northwest of China. As people try to wean themselves off that, as people try to have justice within supply chains, and people try to move towards a green agenda, and the labor unions have a hold on the Biden administration, how much of that is going to be possible? If by adding more and more local content, are you actually putting prices up? what is the, and we've seen interesting negotiations with the Koreans, with the Mexicans, with other trading partners of the US about the local content implications of that. So I think we still don't know how to do this, but the stimulation of a green growth strategy is huge. It allows Biden to go to Sharm el-Sheikh. It allows the Americans to turn up and say, well, look, we have got our own house in order now. Our 2030 target is achievable. Lots of other things have got out, but it is, otherwise, if they hadn't passed the IRA, they were going to have to come to Sharm el-Sheikh and say, we have no idea how to meet our 2030 target.
Right.
So I think it's not to be underestimated. I mean, other important things like US Exim has to invest $650 million of climate positive exports by October 2023. There's lots of, across the government, there's a lot that needs to be done, and how to do it, I think, is the struggle now. So that's the US. I think the EU. Now, the EU, in the middle of this hard handbrake turn away from Russian oil and gas, which will kick in again in the next few weeks as they choke off even more of the supply, has not wavered from its targets. It has just announced that it will not up its target this year, which honestly I think is understandable, but it won't dilute its target. And so again, here, there's two very important messages from what Europe has gone through this year. One is that renewable energy is the answer, and that those economies within the European Union that had more renewable energy in their mix and had gone further down the pathway of a transition have done better. And so, this is the time to say, okay, maybe we should have got going earlier than we did, but it's also a recipe for others. And then the second thing is that managing energy demand is really important, and that works too. So the IEA came out very early in March and sort of said, look, if you manage energy demand, you can manage 10, 15, maybe even 20% down. And this will be very important to you in the winter when you don't have supply. That's all coming true. And some of the European Union countries have actually got their energy demand down by 15 to 18%. So again, we are in the middle of an energy supply crisis, and we see Macky Sall from Senegal and the Nigerians and others asking for, permission or public investment to help them exploit their gas. But the overriding message of the pivot has been that renewable energy is the way out for security and resilience reasons, as well as the planet. Energy demand management is really important. Of course, Europe has been able to hoover up gas on the international markets, which has affected others. But we have to hold both of those truths at the same time.
Right. So do you think that on the energy demand story, that they're doing quite enough, or they've put enough of their chips on that side of the betting board? Because my understanding is that even now the UK and Germany is still looking at sort of multiple percentage points of GDP equivalent in subsidies to keep gas prices low this winter.
So within the EU, so let's talk about within the EU. Some countries, so the energy demand management is going, I think, quite well. Could go further. Will need to go further. Obviously, Germany was highly exposed on the gas side to Russia and its particular journey in extending the nuclear plants. This is a delicate political balance, but I think that they are more or less on the right track. And could they go further? Yes. The UK is a separate story. The UK has been, as you, I'm sure, are aware, on some fantastical, magical political bus journey for the last few months, and did not jump on the energy demand management issue early, and then has been distracted all over the summer. And as the right wing sort of takes hold of the Conservative Party, has also had a sort of fairly incoherent message about exploiting more North Sea gas, and then fracking, and then not fracking. It depends which prime minister we have, and they only last for a few days at the moment, as you know. So the UK is kind of the UK could do much, much more on energy demand. And then, frankly, Canada and the United States have really not taken the energy demand management story, I think, seriously enough. But in the US, there's a lot that could be done to very easily manage. But obviously, the energy dynamics are slightly different. But if we're looking at it in terms of the developed world using less energy, then there are parts of the coalition that has put sanctions on Russia that could do much more to manage their energy demand.
Right. Well, just coming back to the way in which you told the story about the IRA and relating it back to this, the Inflation Reduction Act, and relating it back to this comment about energy efficiency, it seems to me that the path forward politically to action is telling some sort of opportunity story. That's true in the North, that's true in the South, it's certainly true in India. And this is the story that the US tells or has told to get the IRA through. It's curious in the sense that the demand management side isn't seen as enough of an opportunity story. It really is actually, but it's not a big money opportunity story, which is why politically it's less saleable. But I want to come back to your point about local content requirements and onshoring and thinking about shortening of supply chains and all of these sorts of global economic rebalancing that we might have to see accompanying a green industrial policy. And a question, therefore, and I want to use this to pivot to the question of finance at this COP, which is going to be a central issue. The question is, to what extent is this story about remaking your economy to be green? To what extent is that a story that every country can buy into, or even every major economy can buy into? Because ultimately, as you say, countries are telling themselves a story and acting strategically with the idea of being more competitive, creating more jobs. And yes, it may be a growing pie, but will the pie grow enough for everybody? And so are we being honest with ourselves about this green industrial policy as the path forward to progressive politics in India, China, the EU, South Africa, etc., all simultaneously? And then tied to that, if it is a zero-sum game at some level, why do we expect that there will be more money on the table to help countries ultimately compete with the US or with Europe? Are we going to run into that sort of dynamic?
Well, I think that we've done a reasonably bad job at being clear and honest about the fact that what's really ailing democracies, capitalist democracies, the West, is this growing inequality. And what has been ailing us is the profligacy of a fossil fuel economic model that has brought us to the point where we are dangerously manipulating the climate, right? So the two things have to be resolved as one. And where you start to see that working is where those coalitions are beginning to find each other in the civic space or in politics or in economic thinking. And it's interesting, obviously I'm from my accent, I'm British. It was interesting to me that even in the UK, where it's kind of asked and answered, that the net zero, the green transition, all of this is enshrined, right? We have statutory obligations, we have statutory bodies that advise without politics, without partisanship. Even then, we could over the summer have, wildly different ideas about, how you achieve that from candidates from the same party. And we could even sort of dally with for a few weeks with the idea that we had to be committed to growth, not green, and not able to put the two things in the same sentence, right? Well, what does green growth look like? And actually green growth means more jobs in the north of the country, which is where economic achievement is falling behind, the leveling up, all of this kind of thing. So I don't think we're quite there. Nick Stern has since 2006 been pointing out that the cost of inaction is higher than the cost of action. But our economic tools are pretty blunt when it comes to actually, well, in that case, how do we actually measure progress and measure wealth and measure achievement? So I think we find ourselves now at a point where we have these dangerous levels of inequality within countries, and then we have this extraordinary debt burden mounting up for many countries in the global south. And we have this divergence possibly, within the global economy, and there's been concerns for some time that Africa sort of starts to get delinked. Of course, Africa is our renewable energy superpower. It has 10,000 times the amount of energy that it needs from its renewable endowment. It's a puny fossil fuel player. It's 5% of global resources. So it's both a thought experiment and a global economic management issue in order to help Africa exploit its renewable energy resources, right, and not be the continent that sort of gets set adrift. So I think we have to deal with equality and green growth at the same time. And when you do, you start to get things like the IRA being applauded and welcomed in communities.
Right. I think that's a really powerful image of Africa as a renewable energy superpower, in a sense, just waiting to be to be enabled and unlocked, in a sense, to access all that energy. But I think what we are hearing is that in the short run, the question is, and we see this in terms of pushback from African leaders saying, look, we really find it deeply problematic that countries such as Norway, which have got rich on the back of fossil fuels, are voting at the World Bank against providing support to Africa to draw on our fossil fuel resources as a short-run measure, even though it's not going to be a big piece of the overall problem. So I think the thing about the renewable energy story, and I see this in India also, is the promise of it definitely seems massive and everybody buys into that. But the pathway to get there is potentially laden with high capital requirements and high transaction costs, including in India, where, for example, coal cross-subsidizes passenger rail travel, which is a really politically important thing. So if you get rid of coal, you get rid of a really important political linkage between the energy sector and the railway sector. There are many such linkages, I think, in political linkages in the developing world. So it seems that the bring this down to now the question of finance at the COP, the down payment of credibility, the ask of the West really seems to be, okay, we agree with this promise, but it's also going to take some transition. It's also going to take upfront capital in our capital scarce, high capital cost societies. Where is that money going to come from? Do you see any way in which this COP is going to take a progressive step forward in addressing that finance credibility question against this backdrop of, the 100 billion, which everybody agrees is just kind of a, it's just a token in a sense. It's just a somewhat random benchmark that we came up with in Paris, that Hillary Clinton, I believe, came up with in Paris. What is the way forward for this COP to make that conversation a little bit more fluid, a little bit less stuck in this rut that we've been in for a few years?
Okay, so I'm going to get there, but I'm going to just take you back a little bit on the pathway. So first of all, the cri de coeur from African leaders is not all the same. So energy exporters have been very clear that the injustice that the righteous indignation, the righteous injustice that they feel, being with capital too high, entry into global trading systems, ? Where's the vaccine rollout? Not there. Where's been the help? Where's the 100 billion, etc.? Oh, and now we have a war in Europe, and now we have to pay the cost of that in terms of energy inflation. So energy exporters' answer to that question is, you should let us exploit our gas because, oh, by the way, you'd like to buy it. Well, that gas is always going to be for export. The quickest and cheapest way for Nigeria to close its energy access gap is not only to invest in the infrastructure that would allow them to stop venting and flaring their gas, which has been on the agenda for multiple decades and has not been a subject of much success so far. But it's actually the quickest way to get energy to those in the north and the interior of Nigeria who don't have it is renewables, both grid connected and off grid. And actually the results-based financing that's been in place has done really, really well with exponential growth rates. Now that's up in the air at the moment because of local currency issues, but that's been the quickest way to get Nigeria. So, I understand why you need to go into the international arena and say it's not fair, you're not investing in me, but it's also perfectly legitimate for private investors and public investors to say, well, actually, we don't want to invest in white elephants or in stranded assets, which is what potentially some of this fossil fuel investments will be over time. I mean, of course, the other thing is that this is for export. And so therefore you have to, one would hope that countries that want that will then spend the revenues in energy infrastructure that reaches the people who've never had it, because that hasn't happened up to now either. So I think there's lots of Africans sort of saying, well, wait a minute, since when did the gas infrastructure or the oil infrastructure of Africa do very well for many Africans? And those voices of Vanessa Kanete and others. But I think also then listen to the inauguration speech of the president of Kenya, where he talks about the fact, and of course, Kenya is blessed with renewable energy resources from geothermal to wind to solar, etc. But he is very clear that what we need is more investment in our renewable energy infrastructure, the grid capability, both nationally and regionally. So I think there's not one African view. So what's going to happen on finance I don't think we're going to have that big conversation, but that big conversation started in Washington.
If I could just cut in and say, accepting the fact that there are multiple views, would you agree that the credibility of provision of finance is an important question, whether it's a fossil fuel provider or whether it's a Kenyan government seeking to rapidly scale up renewables?
Yeah, so as I said, righteous indignation. Yes, the provision of finance and support for transition, both technical advice and finance, just isn't there, hasn't been there. But I mean, where I would be frustrated is that hasn't come in terms of the support that Africa needs to build the infrastructure and the institutions, as well as the investment in its renewable energy capability, which is by far and above the most competitive form of growth. And now the good news is, now everybody's excited about green hydrogen. And of course, we're now seeing lots of people looking at how to help African countries. But yes, so we do arrive at COP27 with the developed world having little credibility. It's had little credibility for a number of years. The war has made that, I think, even more so pointed. But where I did see the beginning of an important starting of a shift, which will be important, is at the annual meetings of the fund and the bank. There was a non-paper written by a number of European countries and developed countries around what kinds of changes they would like to see at the bank and the fund. And this comes up alongside the very clear articulation of an agenda by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, in what's called the Bridgetown Initiative. And you started to see conversations, and I heard US Treasury officials talking about, not having to treat everybody in the constraints of a low income, middle income, or high income bucket, that in fact you may be middle income, you may experience extreme vulnerability because of climate change, you should be given, or you should be allowed to access instruments under different rules and with different flexibilities than otherwise. And then, a real conversation around the amount of losses when you tallied them up that many low-income countries are expected to experience as a result of climate change. And then again, what does that do to their vulnerability? What does that do to their ability to access funds under what kinds of conditions? So that conversation has started now. It's taken us far, far too long to get to the point where shareholders and owners of these institutions are actually writing and talking about this, but it's there, and that's what's going to have to happen, because to borrow in order to respond to an impact, when it would be much more sensible to invest in your resilience to that impact before it happens, and it would be even more sensible to stop emitting. Finally, we're beginning to have that conversation.
So we started out by talking about how there are many other fora where these conversations necessarily have to occur, and so certainly the bank fund annual meetings and the bank and perhaps to some extent the fund under its new new director, are institutions that are key to this whole issue. What do you think? Maybe you can give us a bit more of a flavor of the sorts of things that the World Bank in particular could usefully do. And we hear lots of calls for sort of MDB reform, where the bank is not sort of set up in a sense to address a problem like climate change. And in my conversations with staff within the World Bank, I sort of sense a real tension where some of the sort of staff who've been there for a long time feel like they shouldn't, in fact, be pulled entirely into climate change conversations. There are many sort of quad development conversations that remain salient that they should be focused on. What is it? Do you see any kind of contours emerging around this question of multilateral development bank reform? And maybe related to that, this question of the source of finance. So we saw at Glasgow that the GFANZ, really Mark Carney's initiative trying to mobilize private investment. But you had a nice description of the IRA, which was really about public investment crowding in private investment. And so maybe there's a role for both those things. And can the World Bank play a role in somehow providing more of that sort of flexible funding that allows governments to crowd in private investment?
So two great questions. So I'll try and give concise answers.
Yeah, we're ranging quite far. I agree.
No, it's okay. So so when it comes to the bank, I think that we earlier we were talking about climate is everything. Everything is climate, except when it comes to development finance. So in the world of development finance, multilateral or bilateral, we still have everything stovepiped. And so the question is not that everything that the bank should do should be about renewable energy. Of course, the bank should be doing, work in budget support for health systems and education systems and public sector management and all the things that the bank does. But it's in the context of a climate crisis. And so, it's quite extraordinary that, the bank still uses the metrics of co-benefits. Right, so here's a development project with a climate co-benefit. Well, here's a climate project with a development co. It's like, no, guys, everything. Your health system is going to be strained beyond belief because of the human impacts of climate change, or your health system is going to get washed out to sea if you haven't made sure that it's resilient to sea level change. So I think that's what people are asking for. And that's what I understand in the development committee of the bank at its last annual meeting. They're going to come back with some new kind of strategy. And it's not that everybody has to be a climate specialist in the bank now. It's just that we have to, in our dialogue with countries, really put this at the heart of the discussion, because it is macro-prudential in terms of risk now. And I think that's for a lot of countries. So that's a short answer. There's much more to say. But then secondly, I think on finance, so GFANZ, so the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, 450 financial institutions, $130 trillion of assets under management, many institutions sort of shoehorned into the alliance in the last 3 weeks before Glasgow. They go home from Glasgow, they open their eyes and they're like, what did we just get ourselves into? And so this last year has been a delicate process of people going back at the level of the boardroom or the C-suite and figuring out, okay, we committed to this. Can we do this? How do we do this? Who measures it? How do I know that I'm doing it right? How do I know I'm not going to get attacked by my grandchildren on Friday when they strike, right? So all of this has been going on. And some really, really hard work. A couple of people have decided to leave because it's too difficult and too unclear. And then in the recent weeks, we've had a real pushback from some of the major US banks, JP Morgan Chase, Citi, and others, basically saying, "Let's just, we're in a crisis. We've got a war going on. We've got inflation. We can't do this." So they too have not got the memo about the centrality or the context of climate is everything. And so what we've seen is the leadership of these alliances saying, oh no, it's so important that we have JP Morgan and the Citi and the US banks in, we should lower our standards. And then you've had other people saying, no, well, this is actually a scientifically benchmarked standard, so we're not lowering it. And that tension you will see in the margins of COP27 and you'll see afterwards. So this is in some ways not difficult to understand. We're in a transition, so it doesn't mean that every day we take one step forward. Some days it'll be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but that tension is there. But what you'll also see in Sharm el-Sheikh is attempts to continue to try to tap into that 130 trillion, which is not 130 trillion, but it's still a big amount of money, to get that to invest in things that it won't invest in on its own and places it won't invest in on its own. You're also going to see, I think, some real pushing from the United States that can't go to Congress and get Congress to appropriate climate finance. So its public pledges cannot be met. So it desperately needs to show that it is leveraging private finance. And I think it will try to do that in a number of other ways, the financial support to methane, for example, but also they're looking hard at how to use voluntary carbon markets more in a more targeted way to try to support countries that are in transition. So I think that's there's some furious diplomacy going on at the moment around those kinds of questions.
A lot of that rings true, and I want to come back to this the leveraging private finance story. But just before I do that, just a reflection on your observation about the World Bank and its framing around co-benefits, or its continued use of the co-benefits framing. And I have to say that it's a framing I found very useful over the years as a way of moving the conversation along in India. And it's something that the Indian government sort of enshrined back in 2008 in its National Action Plan. But I agree with you, and this is an interesting kind of development at the recent IPCC, where the formulation that they came up with was that we now should be thinking about shifting development pathways to take into account both low carbon development and climate resilience. So as you say, to take into account the fact that this is the overriding context within which all decisions really need to be made. It needs to internalize these decisions.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, conceptualizing co-benefits back in the day, right? I mean, was fundamental. That helped turn a lot of people on, and it helped us turn all kinds of ways of working on. What I'm just saying is that in 2022,
I agree.
Maybe the development industry should be finding different ways to conceptualize it. Yeah,
that's right. And in a weird kind of way, it's co-benefits on wheels, to put it very somewhat. It's not just a static concept anymore. It's about all the choices that you're making. But I want to come back to the finance, leveraging private finance, and I think this rings very true to me that there's this desperate, as you say, effort to kind of harness private finance to plug all these holes, and we'll come to that in the context of maybe loss and damage and the links to insurance as well. But one of the places this is really biting at the moment is in the conversations about the South African JETP, the Just Energy Transition Plan. And just recently, there've been sort of some information out there about, look, what share of this is going to be grant money, the amount of money that South Africa was promised us versus loans. And I think a lot of people are watching this very carefully. And again, it seems to me that yes, eventually to go from billions to trillions, you need to have private money go to where the opportunity is. But it might take a fair bit of concessional money to help make the case and lay the groundwork. And it seems to me that conversation hasn't advanced very much beyond the sort of promises that emerged out of successive COPs. So I'm coming back to this question about sort of, grant money, concessional finance, public funds, and so on. And then maybe we can use that to then bridge into a conversation about loss and damage.
Well, no, I think your observation is absolutely correct. We at times are trying to get private money to do things that private money's never done, probably never going to do, right? And so the question then is, how do you mobilize domestic public finance? How does the international community help countries mobilize their own domestic resources, right? And then how do you, if you don't have public money, if the developed world can't bring the 8.5 billion to the table in a grant form, which was probably never going to happen because you're always going to use multilateral systems, and that's always there for even a highly concessional loan, right? Then how do you leverage the private finance so that it comes in such a way that it doesn't that it isn't prohibitive from the perspective of the country? So that none of this is new, right? So this is we've been blending finance, we've been crowding in private finance for 70 years in different formats. We have mobilized private money to come in on the back of public money when the Iron Curtain fell down. The reconstruction of Japan in the 50s was all done with, look at what happened to Korea after the Asian crisis. So we kind of know how to do this. The unpalatable truth, I think, is that there does have to be some kind of public investment coming from developed countries, which will bring us into loss and damages. It's the same discussion. So what do you do if you can't go to Congress and you can't appropriate for, the billions of dollars of climate finance that you're backed up with? So that's where we see attempts to create, aggregators, try to find ways to invest in, new merchant banks and new guarantee companies and other things that, again, we know how to do, but we haven't done to scale. How do you then take the money that you've put in the multilaterals, whether it's the African Development Bank in the case of South Africa or the World Bank, and how do you make that money work much harder? And I think here, this is where you get agreement from all sides around sort of mere motley talking about the $1 trillion that is in the system that should be released, because that's the cheapest $1 trillion. It's much easier than it is appropriating another $1 trillion. And so I think that, and then from the country's perspective, yes, it's you can go to a COP and you can say, I don't want loans, I want grants. But when it comes to the actual transition plan that you have, what's the most important thing is that the type of financing matches the type of project or the type of process. And here I think this is where the conversation about changing the concessionality around funding for the climate crisis becomes really important. And that's going to have to be on the highest concessional terms, I think, that it's not a grant, probably not, but that you change the concessionality. So South Africa's been a brutal year. I think a lot of people went to Glasgow and they said, $8.5 billion for South Africa, job done. No, that was the beginning. So I think it is each country, so matching the financing to each country's transition plan is going to be complicated. A lot of people went to Glasgow thinking, okay, $8.5 billion to South Africa, great, make the announcement, go home now. But of course, that was just the beginning of the story. I think what is important this year, while it's been really difficult, is obviously the South African domestic political context is complicated. And then we have seen a set of private sector financial actors sitting at the table with, international and domestic, political and financial actors. And, that hasn't happened before. Now we do the same thing for Indonesia, for Vietnam. These are all complicated transition stories. So the quality of financing, which financing does which thing best? How do you blend them? How do you stitch them together? That this is going to be the most important thing that we do, because we have to accept that for the time being, sort of $8 appropriated climate finance, that's going to be at the levels it's at now, or even reduced.
And China, a word on China on this. I mean, a few years ago it was all about Belt and Road and the Chinese, initiatives to build their own development banks and so on. There's a lot less of that now. Do you see China coming back into that space?
Well, I thought that the recent Party Congress and the speeches from Xi Jinping were quite astounding in many ways, right? But on the subject of climate, that obviously BRI didn't work out exactly the way that perhaps he'd wanted or expected. But so now what do they do? And I think we're all eyes on how they engage. It's how they come alongside the West, right? So how do they come alongside when it comes to restructuring debt? How do they, which will be significantly and the most important thing for most of the climate journeys that indebted countries have to go through. How do they come alongside in the use of concessional finance, either through the BRI or its successor, alongside what the West is doing? But I think importantly, in this conversation is taking place, inside each of the multilateral development banks, is can we have zones of cooperation on climate inside MDBs or inside the international system, while the rising tensions between the US and the West and China continue unabated. So it's going to be critically important. I think there are other things as well. China's South-South fund, I mean, doesn't get a lot of, attention from strikers on a Friday, right? So, but China has, I don't think, come through with exactly everything that it implied, if not promised. And then the other thing is that we have famines, we have food security crises, we have humanitarian crises all around the world. And the Chinese contribution to that in the international system is minuscule. Somebody was telling me the other day that China's contribution to the World Food Programme is now less than Burkina Faso, less than Honduras, less than Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, obviously, the Chinese can offer aid bilaterally, but when we've got multiple crises in a polycrisis, then working together becomes important too.
No, absolutely, and I think in a sense, after this party congress, we're going to sort of see the direction of travel. I think the leadership has been occupied with this very sort of focal moment, and if there's any sort of new directions, I think we'll start to see it. Maybe we can end, Rachel, with coming back to this loss and damage question. I mean, many people have said, look, this is a COP where some of the sort of key moments, like the global stock ticket and so on, will happen at successive COPs. The global goal adaptation is due to sort of be brought up in a sense at the next COP. Progress, of course, we made at this COP. And the Egyptian minister, of course, said that he would like to focus this on implementation, as you said. But a lot of the speculation has centered on, is this the moment where loss and damage will really take some kind of concrete shape or form? And it seems to be that a lot of the developing countries, the vulnerable countries, are making this the benchmark of success for this COP, and this being the agreement to some sort of facility, even if the contours of it are not don't come completely into focus over these 2 weeks. Do you think that loss and damage will be that sort of issue, and do you see a landing zone for it, and all the sort of comments the prefatory comments that we've seen from the US and others kind of trying to temper expectations appropriately?
No, so I think it is the battle line, it is the Waterloo, it is the whatever the analogy we want to use. And I think for as long as it is a loggerhead conversation, so this is not a comment on the rights or wrongs of it. I mean, my firm view is that we should have been contributing into loss and damage funds for a very long time in multiple creative ways. But so without a comment on the right or wrong of it, a loggerhead conversation where on the one side you've got sort of AOSIS and others saying, we want these words used to describe this kind of thing, and we want it now. And then the US, the Europeans, the Swiss sort of saying, well, we can't do that. We don't want to use those words, and we can't actually do any of this. In the middle is Simon Steele, which makes it very difficult for him as the UNFCCC Executive Secretary, because he comes from one of those constituencies. And so it's always really difficult when your own family is like arguing with you about what you need to do. So some empathy there, I think. What I do see is that if you can just, so first of all, Glasgow last year agreed a 2-year Glasgow dialogue. So I think what I would hope is that we see some movement, but I don't think we're going to get a big deal until next year. But what I do see is that in the conversations around recognizing that countries are seeing substantial parts of their GDP disappearing after extreme weather events on a regular basis now, and that across the world this is happening. It's not just one region or another. And when we talk about how to ensure for that, how to offset that, how to invest in the resilience towards that, how to manage the borrowing costs, you're starting to see people describe what actually would be the elements of loss and damage. And so I think, the US, in some of its expose on what Janet Yellen is sort of interested in pushing in the multilateral development sphere, some of that repackaged and used with different words around it would I think be very welcome in a loss and damage conversation. So I think we've got one more year before that starts to really mature. I think that's frustrating. It's wrong. It's unfair. It's unjust for those people experiencing the damages. But I think at one point in the Bridgetown initiative, it was suggested that every country that, whose GDP is affected by 5% or more should be given a sort of different sort of status as a borrower or as a client of the multilateral system. But I was thinking about this when I was looking through the data in the US. 5% of GDP, well, that's Colorado, that's California. I mean, it's this, and goodness knows we're still tallying the cost of the storm, Hurricane Ian in Florida, which of course it will go down in history probably as the storm that forced the insurance markets to be regulated in a different way, because I think we're just beginning to realize the precarious nature of the way in which we manage the insurance markets in this country.
Do you have a sense of, if you like, you said it'll probably take more than this 2 weeks, it'll probably take more than this year. What are the contours of the sorts of statements that might collectively come out in decision text, or the sorts of agreements that vulnerable countries might say, all right, that gives us reasonable hope that at long last we will actually have the promise of something credible in terms of and I use this word because lack of a better one, compensation or solidarity, a genuine expression of solidarity, given the impacts that we have faced. If I can just sort of push you a little harder on what is that zone?
I mean, I don't know, but I would have thought elements may include, are there any more Denmarks out there? Are there any more countries that show willing? So the numbers would be perhaps not significant enough, but they would be down payments, as it were. Right. So how many more of those are there?
Just to interject for the listeners, Denmark gave a contribution of, I think it's 13 million euros a few weeks ago towards loss and damage. So more such indications from countries, I think is the message.
Yeah. So a year ago in Glasgow, the Scottish government, in order to pull the beard of Boris Johnson's government, put £1 million down sort of into a facility. This was then matched by 3 philanthropic entities with another $1 million each, I think, and now Denmark becomes the first sovereign nation at the UN, sovereign member state, to pay into a fund. So I think there'll be a question of, are there any other countries or entities that would put money into a loss and damage facility? Then there is the question of the sort of the mechanics or formulae for how money would go into a loss and damage facility. And I think there's room, as I said, there's room for words to be drafted that would indicate that there is some movement on that now, referencing discussions that are taking place in other places, etc. None of that's going to be sufficient for small island states in particular, but I think that there's some language that can be crafted there. I think that there is also then, exploration of other creative ways of raising money for the loss and damage facility, not to negate the responsibility for loss and damage of developed countries, but so if you can accept that responsibility is still there, or we can find the language that doesn't send the US out of the room, then are there other creative ways to raise that money? And there's been all kinds of sort of discussions about everything from wealth taxes to windfall taxes to, other ways. And there's been, over the summer, over the last 6 months, there's been 2 or 3 sort of voluntary initiatives or small huddles trying to look at ways in which you could capture some of the windfall profits and see if they could be distributed. So I think there's a third piece there as well. And then finally, I think there's a conversation to be had around insurance, which is not really fully a loss and damage discussion, but I think there's movement in the insurance discussion as well. The thing that will sort of explode the whole discussion is if we get into a standoff over compensation and reparations. And I just feel that the US does not believe that it has the legal basis to agree that. And until there are changes in the lawyers and the members of the delegation, that's never going to change. So I think that if the negotiators can focus on these sort of component elements, we might get progress. But if we get into a big sort of,
terminology,
egotistical, then it's going to be really bad. And the Egyptians will want very much to avoid that.
Right. But perhaps I think that those are all sort of great, marking out of areas of possible agreement. I might just add, I wonder whether you'd agree, another tricky one, which is the question of the modalities of accessing those funds, which is also quite a tricky issue.
No, I think it's very, very tricky. And we've got, the other interesting thing is that the GCF was about to go into its replenishment. So this is the Green Climate Fund, which is an instrument of the convention. And so, there's a whole question about how good we are at setting up new financial institutions and new mechanisms, and how good we are at running them quickly well. But I think the modalities conversation is a very important one. And then all the stuff within the Santiago framework. So this is the technical assistance. The countries need an enormous amount of help. And I think that there's more that could be done there to be supportive of that work.
No, absolutely. And I think that this, as you say, is definitely one to watch. It is perhaps the Waterloo of this particular COP. But I'm glad that in the course of this conversation, Rachel, we were able to sort of draw the links from this this health check event, as you say, all the way out to these other fora and other spaces where conversation is happening, where decisions are being made that are relevant to addressing this issue. Everything from the Chinese Party Congress to the Bank Fund annual meetings, and I do think that while the COP plays this role in bringing us together in a focused way to talk about this, the more we spend other moments at other times of the year talking about it, I think it would be all to the good. I want to thank you very much for taking time early in the morning for you. I know that you will be in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I hope I have a chance to interact with you over there. Look forward to reading your continued writing and hearing you on a range of platforms. And I'm just very grateful you were able to take the time.
No, Navroz, thank you so much for the invitation. And I, of course, read everything you put out as well. So thank you for your leadership and for your intellectual rigor and curiosity. We need all of that. Thank you.
That's very kind of you, Rachel. Thank you. So let me close formally. Thank you for listening to us. For more information, please follow us on @CPR_India and @CPR_Climate. This is the third of a series of pre-COP podcasts. First with Harold Winkler, second with Salimullah Haq, and today with Professor Rachel Kyte. Thank you once again, Rachel.
Take care. Thank you.